Well, thanks for that very warm introduction, and great to see so many familiar faces. I think this is probably my 20th trip to this region, but in a business capacity, maybe only my 3rd trip. But lots of exciting stuff going on here. And some of you may know that tomorrow I am doing a workshop, an all-day workshop, which Jen can feed some details. And I suspect there still are a few spaces that are open. So if you're interested, if you're curious about what's being talked about tonight, you like the taste of it, you could get the full gourmet meal tomorrow. So I have the picture of the bee here because I am very interested in how economic development can start to perform more like the bee. And that is the story of the local economy solution and this concept of Pollinator Enterprises, which I will define in a couple of minutes. But the place where I really want to start is sort of the big picture of economic development. Economic development in its purest form ought to be about creation of jobs, creation of income equality, and also the creation of a tax base so we can do lots of good things with the dollars that come into government. Unfortunately, economic development can be summarized in 3 words. And those of you who have conversations with economic developers will recognize these words: attract and retain. Our mission is to attract and retain business. And what is odd about this formulation is that you cannot attract a local business. It's an oxymoron. And if the only way you retain a local business is by paying it some kind of bribe, how local is it? So what this attract and retain mentality tells us is that economic development doesn't pay a lot of attention to locally owned business. And this is a huge problem. Instead, what economic development does all across the country, and we see it in New England as we see it everywhere else, is pay incentives, grants, tax abatements, capital improvements, various forms of slush funds to induce a company to come to a place or to bribe it to stick around. Now, does this work? This woman here is named Ann Markison. She's a professor of public policy at the University of Minnesota, and she is the author of, I think, one of the best evaluations of attract and retain economic development, which she published about 7 years ago. She put together really the finest thinkers. Some supported the idea, some were skeptical. But her conclusion in the volume is incentive competition is on the rise. It is costly, generally inefficient, and often ineffective for winning regions. Now, clearly it's ineffective for losing regions. But for winning regions, I have to say there's one word that I disagree with in her evaluation, and that is the word often. Because I would argue it is always ineffective. And the reason has to do with what we economists call opportunity costs. That is, what could you have done with the same money had you spent it on local business? So this picture here, I have the picture of the clown there because I was speaking, I guess it was about 14 months ago in Sarasota, Florida, at a local food week, and someone dropped the newspaper in front of me, and it had a big headline talking about how the economic development department there, 10 people in all, had done nothing over the previous year except try to attract a Danish pharmaceutical company named Zelia. And the story was that they had put together a package of $137 million of public money, and they lost. They lost to a community in North Carolina that put even more on the table. Now, what do you think $137 million buys you these days in the attract and retain business? Well, you know, you probably would think it would be in the range of several thousand jobs. But in fact, it was 190 jobs. And nearly all of those jobs actually were already filled by people who would be moving into Sarasota. Now, if you do some math, it works out to $717,000 per job. If you took that same money and put it into a low-risk bond fund, you could pay a family of 4 a living wage in perpetuity and never have to risk the corporate attraction in the first place. But another way of thinking about how crazy this is that if you really love the Danes, and I love the Danes, I love Legos, I love Tivoli Gardens, I love bad pastries. If you love the Danes, why not invite 137,000 Danish people to come visit Sarasota? It's about 3% of the population. And give them a $1,000 gift card that is only usable at local business in Sarasota. And I could prove to you that the economic development impact would be far superior than this Zelia attraction. Now, to give you a sense of another way of doing economic development, I want to introduce you to my friend Lou Stein, the guy sitting on the right in the maroon sweater. Lou was an economic developer in Appalachian, West Virginia for many years. And in the last 5 years that he was working, he generated 300 to 500 jobs per year at an average cost of $500 per job. Now, how did he do this? What was the magic that got him to $500 per job? Well, the first thing he did is he would get together groups of people like this who were interested in launching new businesses, and he would support them in the writing of business plans and introducing them to financial institutions. And then he would knock on the door of existing businesses and ask a question that apparently they had never heard from the local economic development department previously, which was, how can I help? So with this not rocket science kind of economic development, you can do some incredible things for your economy. So this leads me to my proposal of 4 rules for local economic prosperity. Number 1, maximize the percentage of jobs in locally owned business. Number 2, maximize local self-reliance. Number 3, spread models of triple bottom line success. And so if those of you unfamiliar with the term, the first bottom line is profit, the triple bottom line is people, planet, and profit. So you put in labor and the environment in there as well. And number 4, create an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I want to talk briefly about each of these rules so you kind of understand where they come from. Rule 1, why does local ownership matter? This chart here was done in a study, came out in 2003 in British Columbia, and it looked at the impact of $1 spent in restaurants and retailers, independent restaurant and retailers versus chain restaurants and retailers. And as you can see on the left side, $1 spent in the independent restaurants and retailers led to about 48 cents being respent in the British Columbian economy. If you put the same dollar in a chain, it was more like around 17 cents. So roughly speaking, every time a British Columbian resident mindfully spends $1 at a locally owned restaurant or retailer, the province enjoys 2.5 times the job impacts, 2.5 times the income and the wealth effects, 2.5 times the tax collections, 2.5 times the charitable contributions. We're not talking about small bits of difference. And in point of fact, there have been about 24 of these studies done over the last 15 years, and they all show that when you compare two similar businesses, a local and a non-local business, because of that respend, you get 2 to 4 times the economic development impact for a dollar spent in a locally owned business. And there's not a single study that has shown otherwise. But don't take my word for it. This comes from the Harvard Business Review in the summer of 2010. The headline says, more small firms means more jobs. And it's a regression analysis that shows that in those communities with the highest density of locally owned business, there is the highest per capita job growth rate. And not just that, but this study from the Federal Reserve in Atlanta in 2013 shows that those communities with the highest density of locally owned business also have the highest growth of per capita income increase. In other words, if you want to get rid of poverty, if you want to raise wages, the best way of doing so is nurturing locally owned business. Now, there's a whole mess of other reasons to support local ownership. We don't have time to get into all of them, but just intuitively, you know the reasons. Tourists are drawn to one-of-a-kind restaurants, hotels, retailers. Local businesses are what generate entrepreneurship, as the statistics around the state in the introduction laid out. There is a growing literature in public health that shows that local food communities, because they are replacing unhealthy, processed, long-distance food with healthier local food, fresher food, those communities are now seeing reductions of obesity and type 2 diabetes. And there's also a political science literature that shows that those communities with a high density of locally owned businesses have higher rates of voting participation and higher rates of volunteership. So there's a very, very long list of reasons why, all things being equal, we want to favor locally owned business. Point number 2, maximize local self-reliance. And the point here is that there are sort of 2 ways of doing economic development. One way is to identify a couple of key export businesses and throw everything into them. The other way is to try to diversify your businesses and then have confidence that that diversification actually will lead to even more points of international engagement. So I want to give you an example of what I mean here from Ann Arbor. It's the story of a great delicatessen called Zingerman's. Zingerman's was set up in 1980. It had a very successful first 10 years. And then the founders had a dilemma. Do they become a chain like Schlotzsky's? They knew they had to grow to retain their best managers. They decided against it for 2 reasons. One, they cared about quality control. Second, they cared about the relationships. They didn't want to be in planes all the time and miss out on the daily kibitzing with their friends and neighbors. So they decided, rather than to grow wide across North America, they would grow deep in Ann Arbor. And they systematically looked for things coming into the deli and things coming out of the deli that they could build new businesses around. So, for example, they serve sandwiches with bread. So why not create a bakehouse? They serve coffee. We could create a coffee roasting company. They serve ice cream and cheese. They could create a creamery. And then looking at things coming out of the deli, they have great food. They could create a sit-down restaurant called the Roadhouse. They have great cakes. They could create a mail-order cake service. They have great customer service. They could create a training module called Zing Train. So in all, Zingerman's is now 10 independently owned businesses that collectively are responsible for 650 jobs in Ann Arbor and sales each year of over $50 million. Now, I want to point out a couple of things about the Zingerman's model. First of all, if you are a disciple of Michael Porter, you would have pronounced this impossible, because he says you need to throw all of your effort into building export clusters. And you look at where your competitive advantage is internationally, and there's no way you can create a cluster from scratch. Well, this gives a total lie to that. There was nothing going on in Ann Arbor that had to do with food. They created a food cluster from scratch. And increasingly around the country, particularly in low-populated areas like New Hampshire, this is the ticket to success. Building new clusters, diversifying your economy. The second lesson in all of this is who led it. It wasn't led by the Economic Development Department. They were busy chasing biotech at the university. It was led by the entrepreneurs. And to me, there's a real lesson in that, which I will come back to shortly. Rule number 3, we have to identify, praise, and spread great models of triple bottom line success. I think everyone in this audience knows examples of local businesses that are profitable, but also good to their workers and good to the environment. We just have to teach other businesses how you put it all together. These things aren't necessarily in conflict with one another. And one of the things I would point out, I just am finishing a paper now that I'm doing for Baltimore that argues that one of the tools for economic development is getting more and more of your companies to take a triple bottom line survey called the B Corp survey. And it's not just because socially responsible businesses are do-good and we like them. Yeah, that's true. But what socially responsible businesses do actually is good for economic development. For example, if you pay more wages, you increase the level of money in your economy. If you buy more goods from local suppliers, that increases the multiplier. That was the point of all the studies I showed you before. If you use less energy and less water, you're putting fewer stresses on local utilities. So, I mean, we could do this all night, but there's a high correlation between social responsibility and economic development that, unfortunately, economic developers have not recognized yet. Last rule is creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And in my view, a local economic development department would focus on 6 Ps. This is the biggest word slide I have, so apologies for it. Planning, people, partners, purchasing, and policy making. Planning means identifying inefficiencies in your economy, inefficiencies in business, and taking care of them. It might mean identifying leaks in your economy, all the places where people are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services. People. How do you support a new generation of leak-plugging businesses and entrepreneurs to lead them? Partners. How do you put groups of local businesses together that are more competitive as a team than they would be acting alone? Purse. How do we take savings that people have, either short-term savings in banks or long-term savings in pension funds, and put them to work in local business? Purchasing. How do we spearhead successful buy local or think local first campaigns? And policy making, consistent with your bumper sticker, your license plate, I have to say I regard myself as a policy minimalist. And I would be delighted if policy did nothing else but one objective, which is stop destroying local business. And the way the public policy does this is, according to the New York Times, $80 billion a year in attract and retain incentives to bring in outside companies, but effectively to make the local businesses, which are the key to prosperity, less competitive. That is absolutely mad. Now, I have to say, I've been on the bully pulpit talking this stuff for about 20 years. There's been a sea change in communities, not just in this country, but all over the world. Even some economic developers are beginning to change their ways, which I'm happy to see. But one of the things that makes me a little sad is, I was involved in the beginnings of something called the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, BALI. BALI has networks all over the country. Some of them are represented here. And it makes me sad that the typical network is 50% dependent on outside fundraising. Now, what that has meant is that many great networks have collapsed because they couldn't figure out a way of making ends meet. And it's also a little bit odd for any organization, whether it is a BALI group or an economic development group, to promote entrepreneurship in a non-entrepreneurial way. Don't we have to kind of walk the talk? And that's what led me to the idea of a pollinator. So what's cool about pollinators in nature is that you have things like bees that fly around from plant to plant and gather pollens and intermix them. And by creating this diversified pollinator ecosystem, you are nurturing all kinds of plants and animals. And significantly, no one has to pay the bee a paycheck from local government to do this. It knows to do it on its own. So I think that perhaps there exists enterprises like this that can do the same thing. That we can create economic development enterprises that take the best ideas of all local businesses and puts it together into an entrepreneurial ecosystem that nurtures this glorious new kind of environment for hundreds, if not thousands, of new local businesses. And significantly, these institutions are self-financing. So that's the essence of this new book of mine. I have 28 examples of institutions and programs out there that are doing economic development in a self-financing way. And they do it in all of the first 5 categories. Now, it doesn't quite fit in policymaking because I'm thinking about private sector enterprises, but I do have some things I want to share about public policy in a few minutes. Tomorrow, we're going to get deeply into most of these 28 models. But tonight, I just want to give you 1 or 2 examples in each of the Ps, just so you get a quick flavor of what these models look like. So planning. This guy, Eric Koster, runs a program in Washington, D.C. It's a company called Main Street Genome Project. And he gathers data from businesses for free and identifies inefficiencies. And he helps them fix those inefficiencies, and then he splits the gains in efficiency between himself and the business. So, for example, he's working with 300 restaurants. Those restaurants send him all of the invoices they have with suppliers. And it turns out these suppliers never publicize their prices. So he discovers supplier number 1 is charging business A 50 cents a pound for cauliflower. And supplier 1 is charging business B $2 a pound for cauliflower. So he then goes to the supplier and says, I see we've got a problem here. We want to keep all of the same businesses working with you. Can you lower your price for that $2 a pound business? And so he is typically saving the businesses he's working with 15 to 20% of their input prices. This guy here is Gilbert Rochecouste. He lives and works in Melbourne, and I was working with him in Melbourne about a month ago. And he's quite a remarkable character. For a long time, He was the manager of the largest shopping mall in the Southern Hemisphere. And then he started to feel a little bit bad about what he was doing to the economy of Melbourne. And he started to notice that Melbourne was a dysfunctional donut where people went in to work by day and left by night and lived in the ringed suburbs. And he decided to quit his lavish job and become a placemaker. So he created something called the Village Well. And his first project was to help the city of Melbourne convert a moribund public market into a very successful night market, and then convert a bunch of alleyways which had garbage and other things going on at night, and into great new places, walkable streets with public art and cafes and all of this new kind of excitement. And the result is that hundreds of thousands of people have moved back into Melbourne. It has increased the tax base, it has reduced crime costs. Everyone in the world needs someone like Gilbert who's doing placemaking in your community. Purchasing. Oh, I don't know what happened there. That's weird. My slides have died from purchasing. All right, well, we'll make it up. Two models I want to share with you with purchasing. One is a website. There's a guy named Colin Pape who runs something called Shop Local in Canada. He grew up in a small town called Midland. Midland has 16,000 people in it. And in the year 2000, he could see that there was kind of an onslaught of big chains. One of the big chains was Walmart, another was Home Depot, and his parents for 30 years had been running a successful paint store. He decided to come to his parents' rescue by creating a web page that would advertise his parents' store and advertise any other local business that wanted a place on the web. Today, that site, shopmidland.com, has 1,500 businesses on it. Those businesses, pay different fees depending upon how much involvement they want Colin to do in the writing, in the marketing, in the creating of gift cards and so forth. But it has been so commercially successful that this website has come to 25 Canadian communities, most of them quite small, and 15 American communities. Another example is in San Francisco, and it's a debit card called Bernal Bucks, started by a German expatriate named Arno Hesse. And as you know, those of you who have debit cards, they're linked to your bank account, and every time you use that debit card at a certain bank, you get a little bit of money taken off that pays the bank a fee, about 1 or 2%. So what Arno did is he approached his local bank, a credit union, and said, how about you split the fee with me? And I will use that money to teach people how to use the debit card at local business. And once you have this kind of identified, branded card around local spending, all these new people will want to come into the credit union and open up accounts. It was a brilliant structure. He has gotten it to the point where there's several hundred businesses, there's a full-time person that is running this, and it's a great model, I think, for small communities to do in association with their credit union. What about people? People is entrepreneurship. So I have this picture here because it's of a young woman who is at a local food high school in Paraguay. In Paraguay, this foundation, Fundacio Paraguaya, took over in 2002. A high school that had been losing money was run by the local Catholic diocese, and they decided to turn it into a kind of vocational education for people to run, kids to run food enterprises. So the kids who go into this high school, they have to learn one of 16 different food businesses, everything from a dairy to a restaurant to a hotel to a farmer's market. Now, these aren't just stooge businesses. These are real businesses. They cash flow. And those businesses pay for the entire high school. How brilliant is that? This model has spread through Paraguay. It's spreading through Tunisia. There's a UK foundation called Teach a Man to Fish that is spreading this model in other countries as well. Incubators. There are something like 1,100 incubators in North America, and I'm sure lots of discussion about incubators in New Hampshire. Nearly all of these incubators depend on government money, which means that in bad times, the government money gets cut exactly at the moment you need the incubator the most. So how can you make an incubator self-financing? A great model is Fledge in Seattle, started by this guy, Michael Looney Lives. And his model is that when he's done incubating a business, he takes 5% of the equity. Now, it's not a venture capitalist who takes, 99% of the equity. And if the business wants that ownership stake back, they can pay Lives a royalty payment for the next few years that takes care of that. To me, this is the way all economic development programs should be structured so that they bring money back for the next round of incubation. Partnerships. Remember, partnerships is groups of local businesses working together as a team more effectively than they would be apart. So a great example is Tucson Originals, a group of local food businesses that collectively buy foodstuffs, kitchen equipment, and dishes, and by buying things together in bulk, they bring down the prices and everyone is more competitive. Why not organize groups of local business here to collectively buy inputs together to bring down their prices? Another example of a partnership that might be worth implementing here is joint delivery. So this picture here comes from Phoenix, where there is a delivery company called Pickfly that helps local businesses deliver goods directly to people in their homes. And the importance of this really came to me about 10 years ago. At that point, I was just beginning to be a single parent, and my 2-year-old daughter needed a diaper, and I was home alone with her. Now, I would have paid this guy $100 to bring me a diaper. I understood the business model. And when you start putting together single parents, people with disabilities, people who are elderly, you can see that there are vast numbers of people who actually can really benefit from this kind of delivery service. Amazon says they can get you things, within a day or two. You want this guy to bring you books in 24 minutes, faster than the drone service might ever do. God, I don't know what happened to this. It's like I've lost all my photos. All right, well, another example, let's move into PERSE. So PERSE is all about how we get money that we save in banks or credit unions into the hands of local business. So one of the things that many of us have been working on is local stock, trying to make it cheaper and easier for businesses to issue local stock as a way of raising capital and doing so without connecting with banks. And so when you heard the introduction of me, you learned that I was very much involved in the Federal Jobs Act, which is just being implemented next month. That'll create one pathway that makes it somewhat cheaper for businesses to issue local stock. But there's a whole mess of state laws, 30 in all so far, that have been passed around the country that are cheaper and easier still. And the picture that I had here is of a friend of mine, Jenny Casson, who's an attorney who sort of specialized in creating low-dollar direct public offerings that help to serve local businesses. And, you know, my suggestion to you is get one lawyer in this region whose specialty is to issue local stock and to be that kind of pollinator for businesses. Another example comes from Nova Scotia. This woman, Linda Best, runs an investment company called FarmWorks. In 1998, Nova Scotia passed a new law that allowed grassroots groups to create their own investment funds. And more than that, you're allowed to put your tax-deferred pension fund money in those funds. And not only that, if you do so, you get a tax credit. How great is that? And since then, 60 of these funds have been set up in Nova Scotia, one of which is FarmWorks, which specializes in investing in small food businesses and in farmers. Nova Scotia has 1 million people. If the United States had as many of these investment funds per capita, we would have 22,000 of them. So that is what is possible with just a little tweak in the law that could potentially be done at the state level. Now, I promised to say a few things about policy, and so the first thing that I want to say is let's think of things that cost little or no money. So how about just getting rid of all giveaway programs? That's going to be a net surplus that we can use for all kinds of economic development that we know will work. Second, convincing our local governments to move their banking services to local banks or credit unions. The reason being that $1 put on deposit in a local bank or credit union is 3 times more likely to find itself in the hands of a local business than $1 put on deposit in Bank-A-Sore of America or any other big bank. Now, if you think it's difficult or impossible, I encourage you to go to the home of Barry Goldwater in Phoenix, Arizona, where the city has just moved a chunk of their banking services to local banks. Local procurement. Many cities in the United States give small preferences for local businesses. It is not the smartest way of doing it. And what we really need to do is fundamentally overhaul the bidding process that cities undertake. Because it turns out that local businesses pay a lot more taxes than non-local businesses. And if you don't take that into account in the bidding process, you're going to be taken to the cleaners. So if we adjust our bidding process to do a full cost accounting, including of tax money, there will be a dramatic shift of procurement to local business, and local governments will save money. I have this picture up here of a guy named Brian Gallant. He is the premier of New Brunswick, not far from here, and he was elected on a platform that actually says it's going to implement this idea. Securities reform. Securities reform, I already mentioned that there are states around the country, including New Hampshire, that are entertaining or passing securities reform laws. And like everything else on my list, changing your securities law costs nothing. It costs nothing to make local businesses get a better shot at capital. Why not do this? So everything on my list either costs nothing or saves you money. And that, frankly, is the way that I think public policy needs to be reformed. The last thing I'll say about all of this agenda is You can't do everything. And I often have this conversation with, the economic developer du jour of a community who tells me, look, we support all kinds of businesses, big business, little business, local business, non-local business, prison, free, whatever it is that produces a job, we support it. To which I say, great, but I'm sorry, you do not have unlimited resources. You have a limited budget, and every dollar you put to chasing after a Zelia-like company that's going to fall flat on its face is a dollar that is not available to support pollinator businesses. And every hour of your time that you put chasing company deals in, say, China is an hour unavailable in working entrepreneurship locally. So we've got to get smart about doing the things that we know work. So another slide lost. I feel like I've been robbed. All of my slides have been taken away from me. So where I want to leave you is with the story of Aladdin. And you may recall that in the Disney version of Aladdin, Aladdin rubs the lamp and out comes the lovable Robin Williams as the blue genie. And he says, Aladdin, you get 3 wishes, but a couple of things about these wishes. First of all, I can't make you fall in love. Second, I can't kill anybody. And third, you can't get any more wishes. But imagine if you could get more wishes. To me, this is the power of pollinators. Because rather than trying to create or support a business one clunky subsidy at a time, pollinators lays out an infrastructure that enables us to nurture local businesses as a community of businesses, hundreds and then thousands of them. Pollinators also can bring about a happy ending in another way as well. And that is everything that I've shared with you and everything that I wrote about in the book is happening somewhere. There's nothing fanciful or made up about any of this. And as Kenneth Boulding, my favorite economist, once said, anything that exists is possible. What doesn't exist is all of these pollinators happening in one place. And when you start to put the planning pollinators next to the people pollinators, next to the purchasing and the purse pollinators, there's kind of a magic in that synergy that can start to happen. So my challenge to you is, why don't you take the initiative to get all of those pollinators going right here, right now? And we're going to begin doing that tomorrow. Thank you very much.